Boleyn have 6 fingers? That's the question we're exploring today. And the simple answer to it is yes, of course she had 6 fingers. I mean, I've got 6 fingers. I've got 8 fingers and 2 thumbs. But this is a question I'm receiving all the time. And obviously what people are really meaning by it is, did Anne Boleyn have 6 fingers on one hand? Did she have an extra finger? Now, where did this idea originate? Well, we have to go back to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I for this. The source for Anne having an extra finger is Catholic recusant Nicholas Sander. He wrote about it in his book, Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism. This was a book that was published in 1585, so quite late in Elizabeth's reign. It was written in Latin, but was translated into English in the 19th century. And here is Sander's description of Anne Boleyn translated into English. Anne Boleyn was rather tall of stature, with black hair and an oval face of a sallow complexion, as if troubled with jaundice. She had a projecting tooth under her upper lip, and on the right hand 6 fingers. There was a large wen under her chin, and therefore to hide its ugliness she wore a high dress covering her throat. In this she was followed by the ladies of the court, who also wore high dresses, having before been in the habit of leaving their necks and the upper portion of their persons uncovered. She was handsome to look at, with a pretty mouth, amusing in her ways, playing well on the lute, and was a good dancer. So there he's saying, on her right hand, 6 fingers, as well as some other sort of dodgy things there. In the 19th century, Agnes Strickland popularised this idea of the extra finger in her series of books, Lives of the Queens of England. Agnes Strickland wrote, "She had one serious defect, which, however, she managed to conceal with her long sleeves. It was a deformity of the little finger of the left hand, which some chroniclers say was divided and formed 2 fingers. So there we have the left hand being mentioned, the other hand. Now Strickland there says some chroniclers say it was divided and formed 2 fingers. The chroniclers, Edward Hall and Charles Risley, for example, make no mention of an extra finger or anything, indeed, being wrong with Anne's hand. Now, let's think about Nicholas Sander. He was writing in 1585, so within living memory of Anne Boleyn. But is Nicholas Sander reliable? Well, I can give you a definite no to that question for the following reasons. Number 1, he was a Catholic recusant. He was in exile during Elizabeth I's reign. Now, Elizabeth I was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. His book, Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism, was hostile to the English Reformation. He, as a Catholic in exile, was against the Reformation that had been heralded in, of course, by Henry VIII's break with Rome, and then taken forward even more by Edward VI in his reign, and then Elizabeth I. And his work is hostile to the Reformation and an attempt to blacken the names of Elizabeth I and her parents, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. 2, he was writing 29 years after Anne Boleyn's execution. He was only about the age of 6, because it's thought that he was born in around 1530, so he was only around 6 when Anne Boleyn died, and he didn't know the Queen. He hadn't been there, he hadn't seen her. So I think that is a good reason to take his description with a large dose of salt. And number 3, his description of Anne Boleyn is not corroborated by contemporary sources, i.e. the chroniclers, the ambassadors, the courtiers, the people who knew Anne and were actually present at court during her lifetime and when she was queen. And finally, his work is actually full of falsehoods and inaccuracies. He not only does he have that description of Anne, which is not corroborated by anyone else, with the sixth finger, the wen, etc., but he also has Anne Boleyn miscarrying a deformed fetus in 1536, something that is not backed up by any contemporary sources, and I'll give you a link to a video about that. He has her being sent to France in her teens after misbehaving at home. He says that she slept with her father's butler and chaplain. Shocking for a girl in those times. And so she gets, she was in trouble, so she gets sent to France. And those are just a few examples of inaccuracies and falsehoods, things that are not backed up at all, things that we know are not true. So we can't take his work as a serious source. Now, Agnes Strickland, who wrote The Lives of the Queens of England, who mentions the idea of a possible, split finger, extra finger, she was writing 3 centuries later, and she was relying on Sanders' earlier work. Her idea that Anne Boleyn concealed her problem, her hand problem, by wearing long sleeves has led to the myth that Anne Boleyn introduced the fashion of wearing sort of long sleeves specifically to hide her finger, and that caught on in the English court, and other ladies started wearing these long sleeves with these big turnbacks. But that is blatantly not true. These sleeves were already in fashion long before Anne became queen. They were in fashion in the 1510s and the 1520s, and so had absolutely nothing to do with Anne wanting to hide her extra finger or some kind of deformity. Of course, this idea that Anne did have an extra finger has been popularised by novelists. You'll find it in historical fiction. And I've even heard at the Tower of London a yeoman warder. The yeoman warders do tours, they take groups of tourists around the tower, telling some wonderful stories about the tower and some rather tall tales as well, all to entertain and inform. And I've heard one yeoman warder say to the group of tourists that Anne Boleyn had an extra finger. A London dungeon infographic and advert a few years ago declared that Henry's wife Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers on each hand. So 2 extra fingers there. And I've also had people tell me that, of course, she had an extra finger because the exhumation of her remains in the Victorian period found that there was an extra finger. They found extra finger bones. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know where people are getting that from at all, because that is complete and utter rubbish. I have the reports from the restoration work that was carried out on the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in 1876, the minutes of the meetings, the pathologist's reports, the examinations of the remains that were exhumed, and no extra finger was found with any of the remains that were exhumed from the chancel. The pathologist who did examine the remains of the person thought to be Anne Boleyn, the remains that were found on the spot where she was recorded as being buried, said of her hands and feet, "The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot." It doesn't make any mention of there being anything unusual at all about her hands, her fingers. So an extra finger can be ruled out, but there is a possibility that Anne did have something on her hand. We have the mention of something on her hand in a treatise that was written, that was sympathetic to Anne Boleyn. It was written in the early 17th century, and it was written by George Wyatt, who was the grandson of Thomas Wyatt the Elder. Now, Thomas Wyatt the Elder knew Anne Boleyn. He was from Allington Castle, which is very close to Hever Castle in Kent. He was the famous diplomat and poet of the Tudor court, Henry VIII's reign. he was a contemporary of Anne, and he appears at one point to have been in love with Anne. So he would be in a position to know about Anne. George Wyatt, his grandson, is thought to have based his sympathetic treatise on kind of family stories, information from the family, and also information gleaned from Anne Gainsford, who served Anne Boleyn as a lady in waiting. So we kind of think that his information must be okay. He used sources that would have known. And he said, there was found indeed upon the side of her nail, upon one of her fingers, some little show of a nail, which yet was so small by the report of those that have seen her, as the workmaster seemed to leave it an occasion of greater grace to her hand, which with the tip of one of her other fingers might be, and was usually by her hidden, without any least blemish to it. Now, a little show of nail is far from an extra finger. Now, Wyatt's treatise was obviously written as an answer to the hostile accounts of Anne Boleyn that had come up by Catholics in Elizabeth I's reign. So it is hard to know whether he is just mentioning the finger as an answer to, Nicholas Sanders' sixth finger myth, or whether there truly was something on her finger. A commenter on my website, the Anne Boleyn Files, a commenter called Glowbros, on one of my articles there, mentioned how she herself had an accessory nail. Now, an accessory nail is a double nail, and Glowbros was saying that she had it on one of her toes, and it generally affects the little toe. And you just get a double nail, a bit of a show of nail. And I had a look, I had a Google of this, and I found a medical journal article mentioning a man having it on his middle finger, which was very, very rare, but it showed that it could happen on a finger as well, but a middle finger, not a sort of outside finger. Glowbros also mentioned split nails. Now, this is when a nail, just a normal fingernail, has a longitudinal split in it, which makes it look like two nails. So I wonder if Anne had something like that, just a split in the nail or an accessory nail, something minor. But then that's not mentioned by contemporary reports either, and surely that would have been noticed. In those days, which were obviously very superstitious times, anything that could have been seen as a deformity would have been sort of would have been viewed with horror, really. I mean, these were times when things were treated as portents and omens and that. So I just can't imagine, Anne having something on her finger and it not being mentioned. I cannot see Henry VIII marrying a woman with an extra finger or something really obvious on her hand and procreating with a woman that had this, because of course he would have known that there was a risk. He would have thought there was a risk of, their offspring, having this blemish, as he would have viewed it, that being passed on to the prince, the son that he so wanted. Can you imagine the horror as well at court? I mean, the people of, the Prince of Wales being born with an extra finger. I mean, that would surely have showed the people that, Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, his annulment of his first marriage, was wrong and that God was cursing it. These were superstitious times. If Anne Boleyn did have something on her hand, I cannot imagine those hostile to Anne Boleyn, people like Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, who viewed Queen Catherine of Aragon as the true queen. I cannot imagine him not mentioning it in his dispatches to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And then we have the idea as well online of her having an extra nipple or breast. I mean, I was Googling this earlier just to see where it said, and I found one blog saying that the blogger had read it about Elizabeth I, but that wasn't true. It was actually Anne Boleyn that had the extra breast or nipple. And I'm thinking, where have you got that from? That is just a product of people's overactive imaginations. That's not based on any history book that I've ever read or any hostile accounts of Anne Boleyn, from Catholics writing in Elizabeth's time. I haven't got a clue where that's come from. When the idea of this extra finger comes up on social media, I often see comments about how this extra finger and the deformed fetus that Anne Boleyn was said to have miscarried were used to paint Anne as a witch, and that they helped the crown in 1536 charge her with witchcraft. Well, that's not correct either, for two reasons. One, Anne Boleyn was not charged with witchcraft in 1536. It does not appear in the list of charges in the indictments, and I'll be talking about this in a future video. And two, the deformed fetus and the extra finger come from Nicholas Sander. They were not mentioned until 1585, 29 years after Anne was executed, so they were not used to bolster a charge of witchcraft. So, did Anne Boleyn have an extra finger? Well, I think it's safe to say that she didn't. No, she definitely didn't. But I'll be looking at the description that Nicholas Sander gives of her, that sallow complexion, the projecting tooth, the wen that she hid with high necks. I'll be talking about that in a future video on what Anne Boleyn actually looked like. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for all the wonderful comments that you leave on my videos. I read each and every one of them, and they're just so supportive and encouraging, and any excuse to talk Tudor, and I'm there. So please do leave comments. You can subscribe to these videos by just clicking on that subscribe button, and I hope you're enjoying them. Take care. Bye bye.